The latest release of CIA documents has all but proven that we are not alone in the universe. As speculations swelled about the genuinity of this story, an old Soviet general has allegedly spoken about the issue, breaking down in tears on international television. What are the details of this terrifying encounter with aliens, and what do the Russians have to say about it? Is there a bigger cover-up, or will the world finally learn the truth? Stay tuned so we can find out the unbelievable details together. The Soviet UFO encounter. The trending topic online is a declassified CIA document that summarizes a newspaper story from 1993 describing an alleged encounter between Soviet soldiers and extraterrestrial beings that supposedly resulted in catastrophic consequences. This document has recently resurfaced and gone viral across social media platforms, with various news outlets picking up the story and sometimes adding their own dramatic flourishes. Let's start by establishing what we definitely know based on the declassified document. According to this CIA intelligence report, during a military training exercise in the late 1980s, specifically around 1989 or 1990, Soviet troops stationed either in Siberia or Ukraine reportedly encountered what they described as a low-flying spaceship in the shape of a saucer. This extraordinary sighting quickly escalated into something much more serious when, according to the report, one of the soldiers made the fateful decision to fire a surface-to-air missile at the unidentified craft. Here's where the story takes an even more incredible turn. The missile reportedly struck the UFO, causing it to crash nearby. From the wreckage emerged what the document describes as 5 short humanoid beings with large heads and large black eyes, matching the classic description of what UFO enthusiasts often call greys. But these beings didn't come in peace, at least not after being fired upon. The document goes on to claim that these entities merged into a single, spherical object that then exploded with an intense bright light. The aftermath was allegedly devastating. 23 soldiers were reportedly turned into what the document describes as stone poles, with their molecular structure altered to resemble limestone. Only 2 soldiers supposedly survived this otherworldly attack, and the document suggests this was because they were shielded in the shade, less exposed to the mysterious light. Now, it's absolutely critical that we examine the source of this information carefully. The CIA document itself is not a first-hand intelligence report based on CIA operatives on the ground. Rather, it's a summary of newspaper articles from the Canadian Weekly World News and the Ukrainian paper Holos Ukraini, both dated March 1993. This distinction is extremely important for understanding the reliability of this account. For those unfamiliar with the Canadian Weekly World News, it was known for publishing sensationalistic and often outright fictional stories. This publication regularly featured headlines about Bigfoot, alien abductions, and various supernatural phenomena, presented as news but understood by most readers to be entertainment rather than factual reporting. This context immediately raises red flags about the credibility of the original source. The document does mention that the incident was allegedly documented in a 250-page KGB file, and it includes a statement attributed to a CIA representative. If the KGB file corresponds to reality, this is an extremely menacing case. The aliens possess such weapons and technology that go beyond all our assumptions. They can stand up for themselves if attacked. Notice the conditional language here, if the KGB file corresponds to reality, suggesting even the CIA was skeptical about the authenticity of the report. Former CIA agent Mike Baker expressed skepticism, stating, "If there was an incident, regardless of the nature of the incident, I suspect that the actual report doesn't look much like what has now come out from 5 or 6 or 7 iterations of what originally was written." According to the document, the remains of both the petrified soldiers and the UFO were transported to a secret scientific research facility near Moscow. There, Soviet specialists allegedly concluded that an unknown energy source had altered the soldiers' molecular structure. But again, there's no independent verification of these claims or any corroborating evidence that has come to light in the decades since this purported incident. Now, let's address the headline that sparked renewed interest in this case. Former Soviet general breaks down in tears over alien retaliation incident. This is particularly interesting because our research indicates that this specific detail about a tearful general is conspicuously absent from any credible sources related to the UFO incident. We conducted extensive searches for any connection between a Soviet general and this alleged UFO encounter, exploring various news articles, declassified documents, and historical records. Despite these efforts, no credible sources were found confirming a former Soviet general's involvement or emotional reaction to this specific incident. To put this in proper historical context, we should note that during the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union did show interest in UFO phenomena, often viewing them through the lens of national security. The Soviet Union had official programs to study unusual aerial phenomena, as evidenced by a 1980 directive from the Chief of General Staff allowing military involvement in paranormal research. This helps explain why the KGB might have compiled a file on UFO sightings, which the CIA could have obtained after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. However, the reliance on tabloid sources for the CIA document raises significant questions about its veracity. The document itself doesn't present the incident as confirmed fact, but rather as a summary of newspaper reports that may or may not be accurate. This crucial context is often lost when the story is shared on social media or reported by news outlets looking for engaging content. Let's take a step back and consider why stories like this continue to fascinate us. UFO encounters represent one of the great unknowns of our existence, the possibility that we are not alone in the universe and that other intelligent beings might be visiting Earth. When these stories intersect with the secretive world of military operations and classified government documents, they become even more compelling. They play into our natural curiosity about the unknown and our suspicion that governments might be withholding information from the public. But it's precisely because these topics are so fascinating that we need to approach them with critical thinking and careful analysis of sources. Russia, the modern-day Soviet Union, has been a problematic world power for many years. Thanks to its military strength and history of defiance, it isn't too far-fetched to think that Soviet soldiers went up against an alien spaceship unprovoked. Putin and the Russian generals haven't made any direct statements about the alien encounter, which is unusual since the country never hesitates to exert its military tone. Putin's last speech was also about military flex, but did he give even the slightest clue about a possible alien encounter? Putin's speech amid the alien saga. Putin's speech provides a window into the current geopolitical tensions and Russia's stance on the use of advanced weapons systems. Unlike our previous topic, which straddled the line between fact and fiction, this speech represents an actual political statement with real-world implications. According to the translation, Putin addresses several key points about recent military developments, specifically focusing on the deployment of Western-manufactured long-range weaponry against Russian territory and Russia's response to these actions. Let's break down the main elements of this speech to understand its significance. Putin begins by addressing multiple audiences: the Russian armed forces personnel, Russian citizens, international allies, and those who, in his words, continue to harbor illusions about the possibility of inflicting a strategic defeat on Russia. This framing immediately establishes a confrontational tone, positioning Russia against Western powers that Putin perceives as adversaries. A central claim in the speech concerns alleged attacks on Russian territory. Putin states that on November 19th and 21st, missile attacks were carried out on military facilities in the Bryansk and Kursk regions of Russia using American and British weapons systems, specifically mentioning Storm Shadow systems from Great Britain and what he refers to as HIMARS, likely referring to HIMARS, High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. He emphasizes that such attacks could not have been carried out without direct participation from Western military specialists. According to Putin, while Russia's air defense system intercepted these attacks, there were casualties among security and maintenance personnel, though he claims the command and operational staff were unaffected. Putin then discusses Russia's response to these alleged attacks. He claims that on November 21st, the Russian armed forces launched a combined strike on a Ukrainian defense industrial complex. What's particularly noteworthy is his statement about testing a new medium-range missile system with non-nuclear hypersonic equipment under combat conditions. He refers to this system as Oreshnik, which translates roughly to hazelnut in English. Under combat conditions, tests on one of the latest Russian medium-range missile systems were carried out. In this case, a ballistic missile with non-nuclear hypersonic equipment. This disclosure about testing new weapons technology is particularly significant in the context of international arms control agreements. Putin specifically mentions the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) treaty, which the United States withdrew from in 2019. This treaty, signed in 1987 between the United States and the Soviet Union, had banned ground-launched nuclear and conventional missiles with ranges of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. Putin characterizes the US withdrawal from this treaty as a significant error and suggests that Russia's development of intermediate and shorter-range missiles is a direct response to this action. In a statement that could be interpreted as an escalation of threats, Putin declares that Russia considers itself entitled to use its weapons against military facilities of countries that deploy their weapons against Russian facilities. He specifically warns the ruling elites of those countries that harbor plans to use their military contingents against Russia to seriously think about this. This language suggests a willingness to directly target NATO member states if certain red lines are crossed. One of the most technically detailed aspects of the speech concerns the capabilities of the new missile system. Putin claims that these missiles attack targets at a speed of 10 Mach, which would be approximately 7,600 miles per hour, making them extremely difficult to intercept. He explicitly states that today there are no countermeasures against such weapons, and that the European missile defense system is not capable of intercepting such types of missiles. In what appears to be a humanitarian gesture, Putin states that if Russia decides to use these advanced systems against targets in Ukraine, they will provide advance warning to civilians and ask citizens of friendly states to evacuate danger zones. This would be done, he says, for humanitarian reasons, openly, publicly, without fear of opposition from the enemy. The speech concludes with a mix of diplomatic language and veiled threats. Putin claims that Russia has always preferred to resolve disputes by peaceful means, but is ready to drink to any development, a phrase that might be a translation error, but seems intended to convey readiness for any scenario, including further escalation. His final words, "There will consistently be a response," reinforce this message of determination and potential retaliation. When analyzing this speech, several critical observations emerge. First, Putin frames the conflict in Ukraine not merely as a regional issue, but as one with elements of a global nature, directly implicating NATO, and particularly the United States. This framing serves to elevate the conflict to a more serious geopolitical confrontation between major powers rather than a localized dispute. Second, the emphasis on new weapons technology, particularly hypersonic missiles, appears designed to demonstrate Russia's technological capabilities and to deter further Western involvement in Ukraine. By highlighting that these weapons can allegedly bypass Western defense systems, Putin is sending a message about Russia's ability to strike targets, even if they are protected by advanced air defense systems. Third, there's a calculated ambiguity in some of Putin's threats. While he speaks about potential strikes against military facilities of countries that deploy weapons against Russia, he doesn't explicitly state which actions would trigger such a response or which specific countries might be targeted. This ambiguity is likely intentional, designed to create uncertainty and caution among NATO countries considering further military aid to Ukraine. Fourth, Putin attempts to position Russia as responding to Western aggression rather than initiating conflict. By emphasizing that Russia is testing new weapons in response to the aggressive actions of NATO countries, he's constructing a narrative that places responsibility for escalation on the West rather than on Russia's own decisions. Finally, the speech reveals something about Russia's strategic thinking regarding nuclear deterrence. While Putin specifically mentions that the tested missile carried non-nuclear hypersonic equipment, the mere mention of this distinction suggests that nuclear-capable versions of these systems exist or could be developed. This implicit nuclear dimension adds weight to his warnings without crossing the line into explicit nuclear threats. The geopolitical context surrounding this speech is crucial for understanding its significance. The conflict in Ukraine, which began with Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, has increasingly drawn in Western powers through their provision of military aid to Ukraine. As the conflict has progressed, Western countries have gradually expanded the types of weapon systems they're willing to provide, moving from defensive systems to more advanced offensive capabilities, including long-range strike weapons. This evolution in Western support has been met with escalating rhetoric from Moscow, with Russian officials repeatedly warning about red lines and potential consequences. Putin's speech represents a continuation of this pattern, but with the additional element of demonstrating new military capabilities through the testing of the Oreshnik missile system. From an international relations perspective, the speech illustrates the concept of signaling in interstate communication. By publicly announcing the successful test of a new weapons system immediately following alleged Western strikes on Russian territory, Putin is sending a clear message about Russia's capabilities and resolve. This kind of signaling is meant to influence the decision-making of other actors in the conflict, potentially deterring certain actions while demonstrating strength to domestic audiences as well. He is saying that he would not stand down against any possible threat, even if it is from extraterrestrials. The convergence of truth and global security. The trending Soviet alien encounter and Putin's recent military speech actually share fascinating commonalities when examined through the lens of information, misinformation, and global security concerns. Both stories provide valuable insights into how narratives around national security and military power are constructed and consumed in our information ecosystem. Let's begin by examining the patterns of information flow in both cases. The story about Soviet soldiers encountering aliens began as a newspaper article in publications of questionable reliability, was summarized in a CIA document, and then resurfaced decades later with additional embellishments like the tearful general, possibly borrowed from a fictional film. This evolution demonstrates how information can be transformed and sensationalized as it moves through different channels and across time. Similarly, Putin's speech represents an official narrative about military capabilities and international relations, carefully crafted to project strength, establish deterrence, and shape perceptions both domestically and internationally. While the content is entirely different, both cases illustrate how narratives about military encounters and capabilities serve specific purposes for those creating and disseminating them. The UFO story, despite its questionable origins, has persisted for decades and recently experienced a viral resurgence. Why? Because it taps into enduring human fascinations, the unknown, the possibility of extraterrestrial life, and suspicions about government secrecy. These are powerful motivators that can drive engagement with content regardless of its factual basis. For contrast, Putin's speech operates in the realm of verifiable contemporary events, but employs its own form of narrative construction. His claims about Western attacks on Russian territory and Russia's technological capabilities serve particular political and strategic objectives. While the speech comes from an identifiable source, unlike the nebulous origins of the UFO story, it still requires critical analysis to understand its purpose and evaluate its claims. The question of verification emerges as a central theme across both topics. With the UFO story, verification is nearly impossible given the elapsed time, the absence of credible witnesses, and the reliance on sensationalist sources. The detailed descriptions of aliens merging into a sphere of light and turning soldiers to stone stand in stark contrast to the complete lack of corroborating evidence. For Putin's speech, verification presents different challenges. Some claims, such as the testing of a new missile system, could potentially be verified through satellite imagery or other intelligence means. Other assertions, like the speed and capabilities of the missile or the alleged Western attacks on Russian territory, are harder for external observers to independently confirm. In both cases, consumers of this information are left to navigate uncertain terrain, relying on critical thinking and consideration of the source's motivations. The role of government secrecy and classified information also connects these narratives. The UFO story hinges on a declassified document that itself references a supposedly classified KGB file. Layers of government secrecy that simultaneously lend the story an air of credibility while making it impossible to fully investigate. This pattern of referencing classified or secret information is a common feature in many conspiracy theories and sensationalized accounts of government activities. Putin's speech, while not cloaked in the same mystery, nevertheless involves claims about classified military capabilities and operations. The development and testing of advanced weapon systems like hypersonic missiles typically involve highly classified information, with governments revealing only what serves their strategic interests. This selective disclosure creates its own information asymmetries and challenges for verification. Both stories also reveal something about how narratives of threat and protection function in military and security contexts. The UFO story, if taken at face value, portrays a catastrophic consequence for military aggression against unknown entities, a cautionary tale about the dangers of shooting first and asking questions later. Though fictional, it reflects genuine concerns about how militaries might respond to truly unfamiliar phenomena. Putin's speech, meanwhile, constructs a narrative of threat, Western weapons striking Russian territory, and protection, Russia's development of advanced defensive and offensive capabilities. This framing serves to justify military developments that might otherwise be seen as aggressive or destabilizing. The emphasis on responding to Western actions rather than initiating conflict is a classic example of defensive positioning in military rhetoric. The technological aspects of both stories merit particular attention. The UFO account describes beings with capabilities far beyond human technology, able to transform themselves and turn humans to stone with light. While clearly fictional, such accounts reflect persistent cultural fascinations with advanced technology that appears magical or incomprehensible. Putin's descriptions of hypersonic missiles traveling at Mach 10 and allegedly able to defeat all existing defense systems represents a more grounded but still dramatic technological narrative. Hypersonic weapons do indeed represent a significant technological development in warfare, potentially able to defeat current missile defense systems due to their speed and maneuverability. However, the absolute terms in which Putin describes their invulnerability may involve elements of exaggeration or simplification for strategic effect. As we critically evaluate these narratives, it's worth considering their intended audiences and effects. The resurgence of the Soviet UFO story serves entertainment purposes for most readers, but might also reinforce certain beliefs about government secrecy regarding extraterrestrial phenomena. For some, it confirms suspicions that governments worldwide know more about UFOs than they publicly acknowledge. Putin's speech targets multiple audiences with different, intended effects to reassure domestic Russian audiences of their country's technological prowess and resolve, to deter NATO countries from further supporting Ukraine, and to signal to the international community that Russia remains a formidable military power despite challenges in its Ukraine campaign. The careful calibration of threats and diplomatic language reflects these multiple objectives. What lessons can we draw from examining these very different narratives side by side? First, the endurance of the Soviet UFO story despite its dubious origins reminds us that compelling narratives can persist regardless of their factual basis, particularly when they touch on deep human curiosities and concerns. The ability to critically evaluate sources and consider the evolution of stories becomes essential in navigating our information environment. Second, Putin's speech demonstrates how official communications about military capabilities and intentions blend fact, strategic ambiguity, and persuasive framing. Even when analyzing statements from identifiable official sources, we must remain attentive to purpose and context, rather than accepting claims at face value. Third, both cases highlight how narratives about extraordinary threats, whether alien beings with stone-transforming powers or hypersonic missiles that can allegedly defeat all defenses, serve particular functions in discourse about security and military power. Claims of exceptional capability or danger often work to justify exceptional responses or developments. Finally, these stories remind us that information itself is a terrain of contest and competition. Whether in tabloid accounts of alien encounters or presidential speeches about military capabilities, information is shaped and deployed to influence perceptions and behaviors. The critical consumer of information must always consider not just what is being claimed, but why it is being claimed and by whom. As we conclude this exploration, I want to emphasize that while the Soviet UFO story appears to be largely fictional, a sensationalized account that gained credibility through its inclusion in CIA records despite originating in questionable sources, the issues raised by Putin's speech represent real and consequential developments in international security. The development and testing of hypersonic missile systems by major powers including Russia, China, and the United States creates new challenges for strategic stability and arms control regimes. The contrast between these topics highlights the spectrum of information we encounter daily, from the clearly fictional to the factually grounded but strategically framed. Our ability to distinguish between these categories, to apply appropriate levels of skepticism, and to understand the purposes behind different types of narratives remains crucial for making sense of an increasingly complex information landscape. What unites these seemingly disparate topics is that both, in their own ways, speak to enduring human concerns about the unknown, about threats from beyond our understanding or control, and about the capacity of technology to both protect and endanger us. Whether contemplating the possibility of hostile alien encounters or the development of weapons that travel at multiple times the speed of sound, we are confronting the limits of our knowledge and control in a vast and sometimes threatening universe. Thanks for watching. Consider other cards on the screen.